and welcome to this special episode of MENA on the Map. Today, we celebrate together with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation the Euro-MENA relations with all their simplicities and complexities. And when we talk about complexities, we cannot but to discuss the Iranian influence on the Mediterranean region. What are the interests of Iran in the Mediterranean region? How can we interpret Iran's multifaceted strategy in the region? How is the deteriorating US-Iranian relation affecting the Islamic Republic's activity in the MENA and mainly in Lebanon and Syria? And respectively, what is the role of Europe in all of this? In our next 40 minutes, we will try to answer all of these questions with our renowned guest, Barbara Slavin, Director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Barbara. We are so honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Again, Barbara, I would like to thank you for joining us on this episode. Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation is the title of the book that you wrote in 2007 and in which you explored the multiple and contradicting layers of the US-Iranian relations. What was interesting in this book is your observation on the perception of American in the eyes of the Iranian people. With this, I would like to start with my first question by focusing on the most integral component of a nation, the people. How different are the Iranians from their rulers or from the regime? How did the Islamic Revolution in 1979 affect and still affecting public behavior in Iran?
That could be another book to try to explain that. You know, I've been lucky enough to go to Iran 9 times, which is a lot for an American. And I think what we've seen over the years is that Iranian society has become very sophisticated, and the Iranian government less so. So the gap between the government and particularly the restrictions that the government tries to put on people and the society has grown larger. I think there's also been a diversion of views about foreign policy at times that many Iranians, particularly because of the economic pressures that they're suffering now, would like their government to spend less on foreign adventures, on Lebanon, on Syria, on Iraq, on Yemen, and focus the limited resources of the Iranian government on the Iranian people.
Are you still welcomed in Iran as an American, regardless of everything that's happening?
You know, I have not been there since 2013. So I know that there are people in Iran who have invited me, have tried to invite me. But no, I've not been able to go back in 7 years now, which suggests, I think, a lack of trust in Americans on the part of the security establishment. They are worried that all Americans, even Americans who don't advocate regime change, you know, openly or war on Iran, that all of us are somehow a threat because we talk about the issues openly. We talk about the mistakes that our own government has made and the mistakes that Iran has made. And perhaps they feel more comfortable having me not in the country, but it's a shame. I would like to go back and I hope I can go back someday.
Barbara, I would like to take Philip's question to keep on focusing on domestic politics in Iran and discuss the latest development of the Iranian situation. Like after the withdrawal, the US withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, and the imposed economic sanctions on Iran, do you think that Trump's maximized pressure in Iran is creating a new generation of revolutionaries? And in this sense, do you think that at this point Iran opposition groups are becoming weak and less influential?
Creating a new generation of revolutionaries. I think all Iranians, but particularly young Iranians, are looking for a better economy, for more opportunities to live a decent life. What has been so sad about the US withdrawal and the reimposition of sanctions is that I think it's taken hope away from young people in Iran who thought that the JCPOA would be the beginning of a new relationship between Iran and the West, Iran and Europe, and especially Iran and the United States. So this is not creating revolutionaries. I think it's just creating misery all around. And I would say that it's had an impact on Lebanon as well. I think Lebanon's economic problems are tied in some ways to this maximum pressure campaign.
And don't you think that in the next elections in Iran we will see like more hardliners than modernists in this sense?
Well, it's possible. A lot, I think, is going to depend on who wins the American presidential election. If it's Joe Biden, there may be an opportunity for someone who is more pragmatic to become the next president of Iran. If it's Trump, I'm afraid we will see another Ahmadinejad type. But one thing I've learned about Iranian politics is that it's foolish to try to predict because things change very quickly, and often in the last week or two before an election. And you can see a very strong swing. If the candidates are not attractive to the voters, then we'll probably have a very low turnout. And of course, that usually helps the more hardline candidates.
Barbara, this leads me into the question of regime change in Iran. I am quoting Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah of Iran, who said in January 2020 that it's just a matter of time for it to reach its final climax. This is weeks or months preceding the ultimate collapse, not dissimilar to the last 3 months in 1978 before the revolution. Since then, Iran witnessed unreported social unrests and protests due to the economic situation, and in, for instance, 2009, the streets of Iran witnessed the largest protests since the Islamic Revolution, the Green Movement. Do you think regime change is achievable? And do you agree with so many scholars and policymakers in the West who believe anti-government protests in the MENA, regardless of how courageous they are, will lead to regime change?
I don't think these particular protests in the streets will lead to regime change, but the regime will change. It will change over time, depending on who the personalities are in positions of power, particularly what happens when the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, passes from the scene. Will he be replaced by someone similar? Will he be replaced by a council? Will he be replaced at all? I mean, these are major changes. I don't think that those outside Iran have very much control over this process. I think this will happen from within, and there are plenty of people, very intelligent, thoughtful people in Iran who are in the best position to decide what kind of government they should have.
When we talk about conspiracy theory, many people say that, for instance, the US, because they have interest in some countries, they try to influence the movements. For example, we had this experience in Lebanon in 2005 with the Cedar Revolution. Many people spoke about the role of the Bush administration back then. Do you believe that this case is happening, for example, in places like Iraq, like Iran today? Do you believe that there is actual interference from the US in such actions?
Well, look, I'm not privy to information, about intelligence matters. I know the United States has certainly mounted a huge propaganda campaign against the Islamic Republic. We have statements from Secretary of State Pompeo, from Brian Hook, the special envoy, all the time criticizing Iran. And there is support for groups in the diaspora who also engage in a kind of information war against the Iranian regime. But it's not the same as 1953. We don't, as far as I know, have people on the streets of Tehran fomenting demonstrations. I think these demonstrations are homegrown. they result primarily from the terrible economic situation in the country. There may be some in the Trump administration who think that economic pressure, sanctions can bring down the regime, but I don't think that's likely. We haven't seen any defections within the security services. We've not seen the sort of revolutionary unrest that we saw in the late 1970s. So far, I don't think that this strategy is going to produce a change in the government.
Barbara, you've talked about like the period that will come after like post Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. And on this, if we want to reflect a bit on the Iranian ideology and the Iranian influence in the Mediterranean, we cannot like neglect that the foreign policy of Iran is inspired by a set of religious rules and a set of like ideological principles. Do you think that with now Khamenei getting older, that the faith of the Islamic Republic with its values and principles will fade away, especially that the revolutionary guards are getting stronger, and especially that their role is being amplified because of their monopolizing most of the sectors in the economy? Do you think that the values will be disregarded or will be something to look at while like the republic and its structure will change?
I think there's always been a little bit too much emphasis on the religious aspects of the Islamic Republic. Iran's policies in the region are not that different from those of the Shah, who also sought to exert Iranian influence throughout the region, including in Lebanon. I mean, he sent the Imam Musa Sadr to Lebanon to uplift the downtrodden Shia Muslims of the country. And the group that was formed, Amal, was the precursor in many ways to Hezbollah. So, and Iran intervened in Yemen, Iran intervened in Oman. Iran was active, certainly, with the Shia in Iraq. So a lot of this is not new. It just has a different cast to it. And of course, the groups that Iran has supported, many of them have become very powerful and influential, especially Hezbollah. I see it as a strategy that has an ideological component, but also a defensive component to deter Iran's enemies from attacking the Iranian homeland, because Iran has these partners outside who can retaliate on Iran's behalf. And we saw that, of course, in Iraq before and after the US killed Qasem Soleimani. It's hard to say how this will go. I mean, I think that the tension between the United States and Iran is the reason for a lot of what we're seeing in the region, and that the situation was certainly calmer and better when the United States was still in the Iran nuclear deal and was not imposing these terrible sanctions on Iran. My hope is that the US and Iran can return to the JCPOA, and I think if that happens, we will see a lessening of tension in Lebanon and in Iraq and Yemen and even in Syria. And that would be a good thing.
The question of the deal is always like a big issue with Iran. Like, it's deal or no deal. That's the main question with Iran. You've mentioned like the presidential elections, and you think on the verge of these elections, will there be like a possible Iranian US rapprochement like anytime soon? And what are the different scenarios in your opinion? And what is like the main effect on the Levant area in the sense?
No, there won't be a rapprochement between the US and Iran before our elections. Iranians are waiting like people in this country and around the world to see whether Donald Trump will be reelected. If he's reelected, they will deal with it. But if it's Joe Biden, there is an anticipation that the US would return to the JCPOA and that Iran would as well. And that we would reopen channels of communication which were shut after the US left the deal. I think that would be good for the region because the US would be able to talk not just about nuclear matters, but also about regional matters. and we could try to deconflict in a way that we haven't seen under the Trump administration. Donald Trump said he wanted to negotiate a better deal, and of course he never really had an opportunity to do that. He left the agreement and he surrounded himself with extremely hawkish advisors who are not interested in any kind of real negotiations with Iran. They want capitulation. They don't want negotiation.
So, and what is your personal opinion? Do you think Trump will be re-elected, and will Iran try to pressure or do any kind of intervention like the Russian did with getting Trump elected, but this time with Biden, for example?
I think the hardliners in Iran would like Trump to be reelected because he would be much easier for them to deal with and would probably ensure that they get the presidency. No, I don't think the Iranians are going to do anything. I mean, I think they're watching like everyone else, and they see that right now the polls show that Donald Trump will not win. He has done a horrible, horrible job of managing the COVID crisis in the United States. I was mentioning to an Iranian friend that, we have 130,000 dead from COVID. And pretty soon, I mean, by the end of this year, we may have as many dead Americans from COVID as Iranians who died in the Iran-Iraq War. That's not a record you can run on and win. Our economy is in bad condition as well. So it's very difficult for me to believe that Trump will be given another term by the American people.
Going back to Iran and Europe, do you think, what is the role of Europe in the future if the sanctions get amplified or lifted? And even if I go back in my question to the issue of domestic politics in Iran, can Europe play a major role in empowering modernizers?
Europe can play a role. I think its primary role is to keep the nuclear deal alive until our elections, hopefully until next January. Europe should also try harder to trade with Iran and to provide economic relief to Iran, to support the IMF loan, the emergency loan that Iran has requested, to do more trade through Instex, through the Swiss financial channel. All of these things will help ordinary Iranians. I mean, forget politics. Let's think of ordinary people who are suffering tremendously because of sanctions and because of COVID. Europe has diplomatic relations with Iran. It has an ability to continue to talk to Iran. So it has an important role to play.
When we talk about the Iranian plan in the region, we noticed that Tehran, for instance, established an economic corridor to the Mediterranean to play a major role in the China's Belt and Road Initiative. In countries like in Syria, not only Iran established military presence, but also it has been active in a social, cultural, and economic spheres in Syria. Many observers believe that Iran's goal to establish a land corridor to connect the country to Lebanon via Iraq and, of course, definitely Syria. To start with the Iranian presence in Syria, what Iran really wants from Syria at this point?
Well, I think you stated it pretty well. I mean, they want to be one of the most influential foreign countries in Syria. They want to maintain a 40-year alliance with the Assad regime. And of course, they do want the ability to use Syria as a way to send goods and personnel, weapons to Hezbollah. This has always been the case. Of course, the land bridge isn't necessary because in the past they simply sent things, via air, and they can certainly do that again. But this is a desire. Now, of course, the Israelis have been very active in trying to prevent this from happening, and they have been very aggressive in terms of attacking Iranian facilities, weapons depots, and so on in Syria. And I imagine that the Israelis will continue to do this. So it's kind of a cat and mouse game between Israel and Iran in Syria.
On this level, and with the Russian influence in Syria, do you think that Iran can keep on spending money in Syria and sending troops to Syria, and will it have like close relations with Bashar al-Assad, especially that now the Russians are somehow on the ground boycotting the Iranians?
Yeah, they will continue. But of course, Bashar has some problems of his own, as we've seen from his fight with his cousin. And the economic situation in Syria is horrible, partly because the economic situation in Lebanon is horrible. So I think there are a lot of pressures. It's hard to see how this is all going to come out in the end. My hope is that there will be some sort of political resolution that will enable economic sanctions to be lifted against Syria, but it's hard to see that happening as long as Assad is there. And it's hard to see, frankly, who will replace him. But this is the Middle East, and things happen, as you well remember. So we're watching it closely right now. I mean, the Russians and the Iranians have their differences in Syria, but right now they both agree on keeping Assad in power.
And going back to Lebanon, what do you think Iran really wants from Lebanon? Do you think that Iran will give up on Lebanon and Hezbollah in case of a deal with the US, especially after the indirect influence on the Lebanese government and foreign policy?
No, I don't see this relationship ending anytime soon. I mean, Iran was there at the creation, as we say, of Hezbollah, and the links are very, very strong. So as long as it's the Islamic Republic of Iran, I think there will be a relationship. The question is what kind, and if we can see a less militaristic relationship, if there is a reduction in tension in the region, that's good for everybody. And that should be a goal of US diplomacy as well as European diplomacy in the region, to lessen tensions. So perhaps we can look toward a Biden administration to work on that.
Can you say that without Hezbollah, Iran would not have any interest with Lebanon?
I think Iran would have interests. I mean, there are historic ties. I wrote a paper about this in 2008 for the US Institute of Peace, and it looked at the ties between clerics, between families. The Shia families of the region are all related to each other. There are Sadrs in Iraq, in Iran, in Lebanon. The Shia clerics who taught Iranians how to be Shia in the 16th century, many of them came from southern Lebanon. So you will never eliminate these connections, but perhaps it can be, as I say, less militarized, something that can work more toward the national interests of Lebanon rather than just the interests of the Shia of the country.
In one of his latest speeches, Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, advocated for a reorientation to the east, which symbolizes also the commitment of Iran's foreign policy to the Chinese plan in the region. The Lebanese as well as the Iranians' economies are deteriorating. Like, we see the collapse in the economies, we see the devaluation of the currencies. Do you think that the bet so far was wrong, and do you think that China failed Iran on this level?
I think it's too soon to say. I think there are very strong Chinese interests in Iran, and there is a constituency in Iran that looks toward China very much as Iran's major partner economically, even in security terms, perhaps in the future. Again, my hope is that this orientation is not allowed to proceed, that the region will continue to look to Europe and the West. I think the peoples of this region are much closer culturally to Europeans and to the West than they are to China. But if they have no option, that's where they will go. Again, this is going to require very, very skillful diplomacy on the part of Europeans and the United States. I hope that Europe and the United States can work together to counter the Chinese and to show that they are really the alternative for the Middle East and the natural alternative for the Middle East.
At this level, the cultural game will play a major role in like the reorientation of the East, and we're looking forward to what's gonna come in the future.
So also, Barbara, we tried to cover different topics with you during this interview, and thank you for this lively interaction. Iran is still in the lamplight of as the situation in MENA is escalating. But we cannot wrap up this interview without asking you on the repercussions of COVID-19 on the Iranian economy. Of course, it had its repercussions on the whole, on the worldwide economy. But from your perspective, how did you see the impact on Iranian economy?
It's been absolutely terrible. I think Iran tried to hunker down for a few weeks to see if they could beat the virus, but people are so poor, they could not afford to stay at home for months on end. They had to go back out. And as a result, we've seen the infection rise again. Iran, of course, has had trouble getting the protective equipment it needed, getting the medicine that it needed. So it has really suffered under sanctions and under COVID. These are very brave, tough people. The medical infrastructure is pretty good for the region, but they've suffered horribly. And many people think that the death toll is actually quite a bit higher than what the Iranian government has admitted. The world should be working together against this terrible plague. And it's unfortunate that we have all these conflicts that are preventing us from working together.
Before ending this interview, there's a question that interests me a lot. We thought that after the killing of Soleimani, Iran will retaliate hard in the region. Is this a possible scenario still? And what should we expect from the Iranian regime at this point?
Well, Iran did retaliate. It, for the first time, sent missiles against a base in Iraq where Americans were located, and it injured 100 Americans. So it directly retaliated, not through proxies. We have seen some indirect attacks by Iraqi militias against American bases. Fortunately, actually, there were some casualties in March. 2 Americans and a British citizen were killed. We have also seen the Iranian strategy, I think, of continuing to encourage the withdrawal of American troops from the region. So Iran is actually helping the United States leave Afghanistan. They've been encouraging the Afghan government to get its act together to negotiate with the Taliban in anticipation that US troops will leave Afghanistan. And in Iraq, they are supporting Kadhimi, the new prime minister, but their expectation is that he will also call for a drawdown of American forces in that country. So this is a long game Iran has been playing, going back to the Gulf War of 1991. And I think that Iran will continue to pursue these objectives. It's continuing to support the Houthis in Yemen. It wants to be part of the political deal that comes there. And of course, it's very active with the Russians and the Turks in terms of trying to reach some sort of solution in Syria. So I don't see a real change in strategy. I don't think it has to come from some dramatic attack. Rather the patient pursuit of Iran's long-term goals in the region.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I still have so many questions to ask you, but we don't have
Me
time
too.
anymore. We don't have time anymore. Hopefully that the situation in the region will move to a more peaceful direction. We're counting a lot on the European diplomacy now to help the peace process and to accelerate the conflict resolutions endeavors in this region. We really hope that classifying Hezbollah as a terrorist organization won't close the doors on like talking to Iranians and helping the Iranians. It's all a big mess on the Mediterranean, as it was always. We're looking forward to see what the future is
hiding
for us actually. Thank you so much for joining this MENA on the Map episode special edition.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure, and may I please send my best regards to the long-suffering people of Lebanon. It is such a beautiful country, and I'm sure that it will come back stronger than before.
We hope so.
We hope so. Thank
you
you so much, and have a good day.